Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 19th of January 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Girish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson. Deep behind the technical desk today is we will be bringing in Mark Anderson from American Free Press, obviously from the States, and Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches in Holland. So we hope that the best of the technical systems will work today. Before we go there, just a bit of comment on the weather. It's bright, albeit a bit cold here in Plymouth. It's also bright in Norfolk, Rhyl, Rhondda, Holland. London's not too bad. Isle of Man is not too bad, but Manchester seems to be suffering under grey skies. So tough luck if you're in Manchester. Well, let's kick off with all matters financial. Mike.
Yes, and what a staggering headline here. Worse than 2008. Warning over global economy as China threatens to destabilize the world. So while I can agree with the first three words, the rest of it is a lot of rubbish. And of course, the economic literacy displayed by the headline is only outdone by the English literacy in the body of the article. If you actually read it, I do suggest you do. Because it is done down to the extreme. And the article attempts once again to blame China for the bankruptcy of the Western financial system and the knock-on economic issues that our banking system is causing. Now, it's written by Lana Clements, and we'll come on to her in a moment. But here's a typical quote. China's tumbling economy would have the biggest impact for Asian economies, as well as Australia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, and Peru, which depend on demand from China for vital commodities for industry. So let's not discuss why China's economy is tumbling, but hold on. Is it tumbling? No, because actually it's growing by just under 7% in the last 12 months. And of course, George Osborne is ready to award himself another medal when he's able to say that Britain's economy has grown by 2%. And he claims Britain's economy is the best economy in the Western world. So if 7% is a tumbling economy, then I'm not quite sure whether there's an understanding of the word. But anyway, more serious, newspapers are complaining that China's not growing as fast as it has in the past. Why is that, do we think? Is it that Chinese internal demand has fallen, or is it that demand from the USA and Europe has collapsed? We certainly don't find out from Lana Clements' article. She doesn't discuss global shipping. She doesn't discuss that most shipping is, or quite a lot of it is in mothballs already. Container ships, dry bulk ships suffering. We don't need to discuss that there's so little demand for oil that it's jam-packed with into every storage facility available, including shipping tankers, and they're having to build more. But she goes on, because in this article, as I'm saying, she says that debt piles of the British and American governments have leapt since 2008, putting both countries in worse position than they were when the last crisis hit. Not a worse position, putting both countries in worse position than when. So it's brilliant English. But anyway, with higher levels of debt, governments may also find it harder to step in to rescue huge financial corporations if they look set to go bankrupt. I think that impossible is the word which should have been used, not harder. It will be impossible for governments to step in because they used all their ammunition in 2008 and then didn't sort out the disease that caused the crash in the first place. Was any of that China's fault? Well, no, it wasn't. It was ours, and it was only ours. We didn't deal with the banks. We didn't implement Glass-Steagall. And in fact, we aren't going to deal with the banks. The nonsense of the so-called ring fence. It's just ridiculous. Here we have the Financial Times from a few months ago pointing out that the ring fence, that the banks have won a victory. Well, the victory that they won was that they were in fact allowed to move capital from their commercial to their investment arms, subverting the ring fence completely by simply issuing dividends. So really, I would have said that if we, until we deal with the banks, we're not looking at another recession, which is what many of the mainstream media are talking about. The fact of the matter is we were never out of recession. We were living through a depression. We are living through a depression. broader and deeper than that of the 1930s. We're starting to see the effects of that in the real economy now, particularly with the amount of jobs that are being lost in manufacturing and the fact that oil and commodities in general, the demand has fallen through the floor. So perhaps Lana, before blaming everything in China, should think a bit about that, Brian.
Well, I think she should. I'm always interested when you go and have a look at these individual journalists. It's good to go and visit their Facebook pages and their Twitter accounts, because you get some idea of what they're really interested in. Notice she's got the London Eye there. Is this because she's part of the London establishment, I wonder?
Don't know, but she doesn't look old enough to have any great experience.
I'm going to smile there and say she's probably well qualified, because in a minute I think we're going to mention David Cameron's ice cream sales lady, who of course has now become very big in politics. Pretty gruesome state of world economy. Blame China. Perhaps we should bring in Mark Anderson to see what the American view is.
Well, boy, that's a tough tackle first out of the starting gate here. I would mainly note that in our debt-based system, the debt-based economy, you're never going to get out of the depression, because we need to fundamentally alter the monetary system and the way the financial system works. That's the easy, broad way of kind of putting a period on the end of that first topic here for today's discussion. But certainly, the Baltic Dry Dock Index, the Baltic Dry Index is of concern. I'm understanding there's fewer ships delivering fewer and fewer goods because demand is going through the basement. And that's a huge thing. There's such a lack of purchasing power among the middle classes that we just can't move the goods. And as far as oil, we need to diversify our energy and not be so dependent on crude oil in the first place.
Right, and Mark, I always ask this question. What gets reported in the American press and media at the moment? Are you getting a sort of government story, it's all China's fault, or are people looking a bit deeper the US side?
There's a little bit of deeper looking. If you look at the financial press, Wall Street, and some of the Bilderberg connected media, as I call them, there's some blame on China. But then people say the U.S. is too dependent on China because they uphold our deficit spending and they own a lot of the national debt. And of course, that stems back to Nixon's days when David Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller set up normalized relations with China and literally shipped our manufacturing over there and gave China kind of an artificial capitalist system. So that's a little too much history to get into right now, but China is sort of operating on what was initially imported U.S. technology and prosperity that was superimposed on the original Chinese culture in the early 1970s. Right,
okay. Well, I take it that guns are pretty important in the States at the moment.
In a philosophical sense, they certainly are. It's the most heavily armed country in the world in terms of sheer numbers. But what you're showing on the screen there is, of course, the ongoing issue I've been covering for several years off and on, and that's Real ID. Basically, it's an enhanced driver's license whereby a lot of personal data would be digitally stored on these driver's licenses or IDs, and it'd be kind of like, papers, please. A all-encompassing document or ID that Americans would be required to carry. And the way they're starting is through the Department of Homeland Security. And in more and more states, Americans cannot board a plane, or at least that's going to be the reality pretty soon. A regular driver's license or a regular state-issued ID without all the bells and whistles, those regular ID.
We will leave Mark there for the moment and see whether we can get him back a little bit strongly at the moment. Do we have Alex, or does that...
Yes, Ryan, the North Sea is shallower and narrower than the pond, and I think that the Gremlins are not quite as able to attack the traffic all the way over to here as they are over to Texas, but we shall see.
Okay, Alex, I'll just ask you on the subject of the economy, and of course shipping traditionally has been of immense importance for Holland and Rotterdam, vast port. Are there any comments on this fall in world shipping trade in Holland that you're picking up?
Well, Brian, the Dutch press is such that if there is a general concern in Netherlands PLC that shipping is hitting rock bottom, you can be sure that the Dutch public, through the Dutch media, will be the last to hear about it. There'll be a stitch up first. But I am here within striking distance of all three of the ports that Benelux use to export their own and German stuff, which is Rotterdam, or Europort these days, Flushing, and Antwerp, just over the border in Belgium. And I am in all three cities regularly with friends to visit and so on. So I am going to keep an eye out for what is going through those ports, and particularly how empty the container ships appear as they are leaving Europe, because that implies, if they are empty, that Europe is not exporting much, even Germany. Now, the crucial thing to watch here, and if Mark's back, you may want, or otherwise Mike, you may want to talk about the currency angle, which I'm not so expert in. But the point about the euro is it has deliberately priced German exports such as to be attractive to Asia at the expense of pricing other countries with higher labour costs out of the market, France and Italy in particular, with their very strong exporting sectors. Benelux isn't suffering so much from that yet because their whole economy and standard of living is very closely tied to Germany, much more than it is to France or Italy or Spain or whatever. But the biting point will definitely be if the Dutch economy itself suffers. The only thing I would say about that at the moment, which we do know for certain, is that the European Union sanctions on Russia, which have now been reciprocated, put a huge wave of Dutch fruit and veg companies out of business overnight. And next to suffer will be the flower bulb exporters. And after that, I suppose, the food exporters, which are a huge category, slice of the Dutch market too. So the Dutch economy is the bellwether, is the canary in the mine shaft here.
Okay, right, lovely. Thank you for that. I think we've got Mark back, so let's have a look at the UK-US connection. Mark, can you hear me? Okay. All right. Let's just move on through. We can always come back to Mark's information. I'm going to just pass to you, Mike, if I can, for an update on Anthony Carlin. This is the Northern Ireland policeman who decided he'd had enough of corruption in the courts and took steps to arrest a judge recently. And some very interesting events have been happening with his court case.
Yes. So if you remember, what happened was that last week he was in court. Basically, this was to do with a repossession hearing, which he thought was sorted out in 2013. He had won that case. Santander attempted to bring the case back into court. And so the hearing last week was in order to try to squash Santander's attempts to bring this back into court. The judge found against Anthony and for Santander, and as a result, he attempted to arrest the judge. He did arrest the judge as a serving policeman, a Northern Ireland policeman. So this is the Belfast Telegraph here, reporting on the events that took place yesterday, because as a result of Anthony's arrest of the judge, he was held in contempt of court, criminal contempt of court, by the judge, and was due to appear in court yesterday to apologise. In fact, to sit in a trial. But Anthony had made it quite clear that he felt that this was inappropriate, that a judge should act as prosecutor, jury and judge in the trial. And it seems that, in fact, what has happened is that the judge has backed down on that one, clearly didn't feel that he was on sound legal ground. And so he has passed this to the Attorney General of Northern Ireland. So it's effectively been politicised at this point, because the Attorney General's role, of course, is as the legal advisor to the government in Northern Ireland, as in any any UK country. Now, where are we at? Well, the people that have been talking to me, who are people that were witnesses in the court case, have made the point that the Attorney General in Northern Ireland, as in Britain as a whole, is considered as guardian of the rule of law. And the point is that the reason that Anthony Carlin arrested the judge in the first place was that, as many of the people that were witnessing the events last week reported, the judge had, without question, stepped outside the law when he made that judgment. That resulted in the arrest. So there is a big question about what's going to happen next. Is the Attorney General actually going to prosecute this case, as the Belfast Telegraph is implying here, or is he going to step back and do something else? Many people that are familiar with the situation are concerned that an example will be made of Anthony Carlin, including continuing efforts in the mainstream media to blacken his name, perhaps. But in the meantime, it is a bit of a conundrum for the legal institutions find themselves in Northern Ireland, and the Attorney General as well, because it's a pretty difficult legal question that a serving police officer effecting an arrest has been prevented from making that arrest.
It's a very, very serious and important case. And just for people who may not know anything about it, of course, what it comes back to is fraudulent action by the banks, backed up by fraudulent action in courts, evidence withheld, evidence concealed, perjury. All of this is coming to the fore. We've seen this as well with the Tom Crawford case. And then at the end of the day, a single judge is deciding, well, he's quite happy with his situation. And
sorry, Brian. Yes, I mean, that's absolutely right. And I would just like to reinforce the point here that in the Tom Crawford case, in the Anthony Carlin case, and some of the other cases that we're aware of, at every one of these cases, what it came down to was the person having their property removed saying to the court, all that it takes is for the bank to provide evidence that I owe this money and I will pay the money. And at no point has the evidence been provided, and at no point has the judge stood up for the individual asking the bank to provide evidence of the debt. It seems like a very simple thing, provide evidence of the debt and I'll pay it. In Anthony Carlin's case, he has evidence, a piece of paper, which demonstrates that his balance was zero. And in Tom Crawford's case, that was allegedly a case of fraud where somebody transferred a mortgage agreement to another format without informing Tom Crawford and his wife. So fraud following this, and court cases where people are simply saying provide evidence that I owe money and no evidence being shown.
And the whole process backed by judges who then claim that they are above the law. And in this case, a policeman decided to take them on by making that arrest. Of course, if we have a situation where judges are above the law, then we are fully into a dictatorship and we're in a very dangerous situation. We're going to try again to bring Mark back on screen, I think.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yeah, we can. You're very clear, so just go for it while you can, I think. Very happy for you to come back on your original topic or to comment on the courts one, if you could just hear what we had to say.
Yeah, I was listening. Just to wind up the Real ID thing, the no-fly list that the post 9/11 Federal Department of Homeland Security put together is now being eyed by a U.S. Senator, Chuck Schumer, as a don't buy a gun or can't buy a gun list, as this American Free Press article you've shown shows. So that's the other thing, the other half of that issue is that no-fly list, which is arbitrarily and secretively drawn up and no one knows who's on it, that no-fly list could be used as a guide for who cannot be allowed to purchase a firearm legally in the United States. So you can learn more at AmericanFreePress.net on that one. And on the financial one, the fraudulent debt, I'll just mention that an activist, a very well-read activist and well-researched one in Pennsylvania, I know, he points out that when a bank makes a loan, they don't loan their depositors money, nor do they loan their own money. Even whether it's a mortgage or a car loan, bank loans, the banks take no risk at all. The only person taking a risk in the deal is the debtor who puts his property up for collateral. So loans are fundamentally fraudulent and very shaky in terms of the legal ground they stand on right from the get-go. So the fraud in banks runs very deep, and the judges, as you alluded to, Brian, they protect the banks, and that is a clear sign of tyranny.
Okay. Well, another sign of tyranny, of course, is when the state turns on its own people, particularly using paramilitary police or even the armed services. And this story of the occupation in Oregon, we're very grateful for an update on this story. We haven't heard a great deal about it and where it is now. So can you bring us up to date, please?
I'm sorry, what topic?
This is your American Free Press one on the Oregon situation, occupation.
I'm sorry. I was distracted. I'm not seeing everything on the screen now. I'm only hearing you and not seeing that. Yeah, the Oregon standoff can be summed up as that they're going into their third week. We had an American Free Press correspondent there, John Friend, for a couple of days. He did a very good job. You can read about it on AmericanFreePress.net. Dwight and Stephen Hammond, those are the property owners that were resentenced in October of 2015 to serve 5 years in prison under a federal anti-terrorism law. And keep in mind that the U.S. Constitution forbids double jeopardy. And yet, the Hammonds, Dwight and Stephen, father and son, who live out in the American Northwest, after they served their initial shorter terms for alleged arson under these anti-terrorism laws, they were resentenced, this is double jeopardy, by a federal initiative to serve their mandatory 5-year prison sentences. And that's why Ammon Bundy, the son of the famed Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, that's why Ammon and his Oregon militia, as they're called, that's why they took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge building in protest of the Hammonds under double jeopardy being resentenced under this anti-terrorism law to serve that 5-year sentence. And I'll just kind of wind that up by saying that the Hammonds were convicted of arson under this arbitrary anti-terrorism law, but what they actually lit was a protective kind of fire where it's called like a backfire. That's what it's called. And the backfire is a controlled burn. And they lit that backfire to prevent a larger forest fire from happening. Thereby, they saved lots of federal and state public and private land from being overwhelmed by fire. They actually saved the day, and yet they're going to prison for 5 years, and that's why the Oregon Wildlife Refuge is being occupied by what I understand is a couple hundred people now. And so in a nutshell, if you will, that's the story, and the standoff continues. The people conducting the standoff have been wanting to reach out to the community to prove that they're not a threat to school kids, to prove they're not a threat to the general community. They're 50 miles away from the nearest school, and yet the local sheriff will not let them use any other venues like local fairgrounds or local facilities to directly address the public and say, we are not a threat to the surrounding community. We just want justice for Dwight and Stephen Hammond and that arbitrary double jeopardy sentence. So that's where we're at in terms of the basics.
Mark, thank you very much for that. A couple of people have remarked in the chat box that the mainstream media seems desperate to, of course, brand all of the occupiers as dangerous terrorists. And I was interested to see that one video on YouTube, which had that sheriff that you've mentioned present, was filmed by a media outlet called Vice. When I did a little bit of research on that organisation, I didn't get a warm feeling. It tried to make out that it was grassroots, but I think this was basically undercover state reporting. They were focusing, I think, quite heavily on the fact that everybody that had come in to support the occupation was a danger. All right, I think what we'll do is we'll move through to, first of all, an advert for the fact that it's Ian Crane will be appearing in court tomorrow. Ian would love to have some support, of course, calm, polite, reasonable, but the idea is that the public present in the courtroom is always a great one for focusing the attention of the judicial system. The public is watching to see and hear justice being done. So that's at 11 o'clock. It's Rathlin Energy versus Ian R. Crane, Rolls House, 7 Rolls Building, London, EC4A 1NL, 11 o'clock tomorrow, and Ian will be very grateful for anybody who can turn up there to support him. Right. Mark, we'll have another go at you a little bit later, but let's just switch across to the Netherlands at the moment. And Alex, you've been picking up on the subject of immigration.
I have, Brian, and thanks for that Telegraph report on screen. Now, that goes all the way back to 2012, and it's headlined, Britain's migration rules are tearing families apart. Now, this is the first background piece to what I wanted to talk about in a moment, and it's actually written by Dr. Brooke Magnanti, or Magnanti is how you spell it. She is the famous ex-diarist call girl, Belle de Jour. So what the point is here is that the Telegraph from about 2012 has had a women's section heavily feminist, and not to the taste of many UK column readers, but she is actually saying, as an American in London, that she's had a lot of problems with the government policy of the last few years with residents. And if you sort the comments by best under this 2012 article, most recommended that is, you'll actually see a lot of people who are core Telegraph readers are in agreement. And for example, the top rated one says, the apathy of the British people who aren't even aware that their most fundamental rights are being taken away is beyond belief. This is how Hitler started in the 1930s. You people just wear the yellow star for a while. So even if you might say that the new left feminist movement is not very happy with this latest Conservative government's policy on integration, and it's all coming out of Queen Anne's Gate. It's Home Office policy, and they're sounding out, I think, what the public's prepared to put up with. And by way of second backstory, I mentioned a Japanese article in English to you. Do you have that? There we are.
There we are. We just brought that up.
This is Japan Today from 2013, and it notes that Japan plays host to one of the largest British expatriate communities in the world that is outside the EU and the Commonwealth. Now, for the EU, there are treaty obligations that Her Majesty's government's not prepared to infringe to allow spouses to be brought back. And for the Commonwealth and the US, there are ties of kin and of language and law, plus in some cases very narrow treaty agreements. So the government can't fiddle with that too much. But Japan is the largest case where, although this is obviously aimed at the Muslim world, Japan as a country not tied by treaty to the UK in any way is experiencing problems. There are thousands of British men, particularly, but also some British women in Japan, who are unable to bring back their spouses whom they married in Japan to live in Britain when their jobs in Japan end or when they wish to come back to the UK. They're actually being kept out of the country, in denial even of the supposed European Convention on Human Rights entitlement to an undisturbed family life. Now, these two are background to the latest piece, which I wanted to point out, which I think you have on another slide there. That's it. And this is by that inimitable brain box, Claire Foges, whom you've mentioned in the past. And here she is. She seems to be wheeled out now every time the Home Office wants to trial something. And until 2015, she was Prime Minister David Cameron's speechwriter, before which she was, as the gushing piece in the Daily Mail says, a raven-haired poet. And before that, she was an ice cream seller. And there's been a raft of articles recently about the idea of denying people, even retrospectively, their British citizenship, or at least their residence permit, their ILR, indefinite leave to remain, even after they have married and settled with a British citizen in Britain. Now, the Home Office seems to think that it can just trial this and use these airheads to say, isn't it awful that these people can't speak English? We ought to get rid of them. And she's even recycled in her piece, this is how unintellectual it is, the same line that I recognised her writing last month in the Telegraph. She says, can you imagine the French behaving in such an acquiescent way about the learning of their own language? Non. That she used exactly the same line in a piece a month ago. So she's just a rent-a-pen, really, that she supposedly put in front of the masses. The point about all this, Brian, in a nutshell, is it's contrary to treaties. Governments can't act willy-nilly. You might not like the phrase international law if you're a sovereignty-minded person in the constitution list, but there are treaty obligations. And as you go from Europe, from east to west, you see different attitudes towards citizenship. Russia will not even extradite its citizens. The Germanic countries will never abrogate anyone's citizenship, even if it was acquired by naturalization as an adult. Then you've got France and Spain, and in fact the US and Canada, which are now currently trying to introduce statutes to be able to alienate people from their nationality, even though it's unconstitutional in those countries. And Britain seems to be in that category. It's got a very slapdash attitude now, Britain, to its own citizens' nationality. And where it's heading, I think, is that citizenship, even for native British people, is going to end up being an entitlement, sorry, a privilege rather than an entitlement or a blood right. And that you can have it stripped as an adult, just as the Soviet Union did for some of its dissidents, for un-British behaviour.
British behaviour, of course, being David Cameron's stated behaviour. So look out the pigs. But the BBC always very good at making comment, and I just found this one when I went looking for ice cream sellers. So Woman's Hour thinks that this woman is wonderful. Here she is, all scrubbed up, basically, looking good. And the BBC pushing her out. So here we've got ice cream seller, advisor to, script writer for Cameron, and now advisor, now policy advisor. This is dangerous stuff. I've got some more on this sort of, I'm going to call it subversion by the British government, if we've got time towards the end of the programme. But I'll just move on, if I may. You'd picked up on this headline about public land in Holland.
Yes, this is the PZC, which is the local paper for the province of Zeeland in the southwest Netherlands. And as often, Brian, you get these brilliant one-liners in the Dutch press that make you think, hang on, this applies to Britain too, except we don't read about it in the news. And I'm sure it applies to the United States as well. The local councils, municipalities as they would be called in the US, I think, are actually now commissioning consultancies to tell them impartially whether or not they should persist with their policy of holding lands. Now, it's questionable, even in the Dutch civil law constitution, whether it is lawful for councils to hold land or whether that actually exceeds their powers. It's whether it's ultra vires. Certainly in a common law jurisdiction of Britain or the United States or any Commonwealth country, there's even more grounds to argue that councils are exceeding their powers by holding land, particularly if it's for purposes of speculation and accumulation. But here you are, you've got a one-liner in this piece that simply says the council has in the past held land. It is now questionable whether this is good value, especially if the council sits on the land and leaves it undeveloped and unfarmed for years. And it suddenly occurred to me, if the Dutch councils are being open about this, then British councils are being shown up because they hold huge deposits of land, as they do in the United States, municipal, state and federal level, and that's what the Oregon bust-up is about. But it's not coming to the surface in English-speaking countries that what they are doing is not only perhaps no sound financial sense, but may even be unlawful.
Okay, Alex, thank you very much for taking us through that. There's a lot to be talked about on this subject of land, because we've been getting a lot of emails and texts with information about the Church of England selling off land, consecrated ground going to developers. We will come on to that in the next few days. And as you say, land, a big issue in America, particularly with those plans for Agenda 21 and removing those inconvenient people, the carbon footprint from the land. No doubt Mark will have something to say about that. Do we try Mark on this at this point, Michael? Yeah, we'll see whether we've got him with audio. Can you speak, Mark?
Yeah, loud and clear, I hope.
Yes, indeed. While you're talking, if you just want to, I've just mentioned Agenda 21 and stripping people off the land in America. It's one of the things that I was fascinated when I first saw those maps of how vast tracts of America were going to be returned to the wild and people concentrated in the cities. That, I take it, that policy is still moving ahead.
By all indications, yes. Alex makes some really good points here. Municipalities, states, and the federal government buying up all the land has terrible effects. Number one, it drives up the cost and taxes on existing private land that's still left. It crowds out the property, if you will. And then you have the abrogation of rights like the Oregon situation. The federal government in the United States, simply put, should sell off most of that land west of the Mississippi River. A lot of that could be put toward the national debt to the extent that the national debt is legitimate. And all sorts of reforms could be made that would make land and homes more affordable for the U.S. middle class. And that same philosophy could carry overseas as well.
Mark, you sent us this article, which again is sort of touching on similar subjects because it's referring to the between the relationship between the states and the federal government. And Governor, in your state of Texas, the governor seems to be pretty keen to push ahead with some constitutional reform as far as Texas is concerned, anyway, or certainly they want to redefine the relationship between the federal government and the state government.
Yeah, Greg Abbott, the new governor in Texas, used to be the attorney general, and at that time, he was one of the loudest protesters against the United Nations Arms Trade Treaty. So, Greg Abbott, the Texas governor, is no armchair governor. Even though he sits in a wheelchair, he's handicapped from an accident he had jogging. And at any rate, he's a very interesting governor, probably the best one we've had in a long, long time, certainly better than George W. Bush or Rick Bilderberg Perry. But this news item basically says that Governor Abbott feels that the individual 50 states in the United States should push back against federal overreach, and that they should have a conference of the states whereby the states could kind of redraw the constitutional lines, redraw the rules a little bit to give the states more power. One example would be if a federal law was seen to be too onerous, then if you had 2/3 of the states that were against that federal law, then that federal law could be nullified, what's known as nullification in the American vernacular. So that would be one of the big changes the governor's calling for, is where the states, 2/3 of them, could nullify onerous or tyrannical federal laws. And that's across the board. Overreaching Supreme Court rulings, overreaching congressional statutes, overreaching with federal executive orders. President Obama, since his State of the Union speech the other night, is trying to get more gun controls by going around Congress and enacting those controls through executive orders. So I think Governor Abbott is onto something. Some people don't agree with the Conference of the States. They think the wrong people will redraw the Constitution and we'll end up with something worse. Others think the Conference of the States is the way to go. So we'll see how this plays out, but it's an interesting move by a very interesting governor.
Okay, Alex, beg your pardon, Mark, thank you very much for that. Alex, I don't know whether you wanted to comment on that at all, since we introduced it on the back of your low-lying Dutch land.
Yes, I think the thing I'd say about that, beg your pardon, is that constitutions are often called living documents these days, particularly by the enemy, the new left and the new right, whereas the old left and the old right rightly point out that constitutions are fixed in time and meant specifically to be immutable in order to thwart the nefarious intent of later presidents and executive branches that come along, or even judicial sabotage like you get in Europe and the US now. The Dutch have a very sensible approach. They've got a civil law constitution, but it was drafted so as to be in the hands of the people in the sense of parliament, and they openly publish everything that they're doing to tweak the constitution, and there are periods within which you can object as a private citizen or as a council or as a state body to any proposed change to the Dutch constitution. It's all done out in the open. Very different from the French, who just, as we've seen after the Paris attacks, decide by executive order to remove clauses from the constitution and strike out whole protections and put in new state entitlements. Again, the question is, we in Britain, we're not au fait with this way of doing things. We've gone to sleep for a long time, and most of us seem to think that we don't have a constitution, and those that are aware of we have a constitution are not bold enough to say, well, it actually takes precedence over parliament and over statute law. So let's not sleepwalk into anything. Let's be as awake as the Americans and as the Dutch are.
Okay, thank you for that. So we'll jump from American land issues and constitutional issues over to Serbia, and you'd picked up on this very interesting article.
Yes,
on pro-Russian cronies in Serbia replaced by pro-EU cronies. What's been happening here?
I must confess, Brian, I've added in my translation the comment by pro-EU cronies. The Russian website shipilov.com doesn't actually say that bit. The headline just says lots of pro-Russians arrested in Serbia, 80 of them at once, and it links to a Serbian Interior Ministry press release. This happened on the 26th of December last year, when the world was asleep as usual, and it's the Balkans. You don't arrest 80 cronies for the sake of suspecting them of corruption. You replace them because someone else wants to take over. And it would seem that after years and years of being fiddled with, Serbia, and having had Yugoslavia dismantled from around it, is now in a position where Serbia, the only pro-Russian element left in ex-Yugoslavia, is going to have all of its pro-Russian people taken out at once. And you don't do that unless, if you're the people arresting, unless you have a plan to install en bloc a new bunch of people in their place. And one of the people arrested was actually the former Minister of Trade of Serbia. So that implies to me, certainly the last Balkan wars for the last 20 or 30 years have been about this, the trade and access to raw materials. It implies that that particular node, trade and export, is where Serbia is going to be got at, and that it's going to be resubordinated from being a Russian client state to a European client state. That said, of course, the Yugoslavs were very independent-minded in the Tito era, and they never were a Russian satellite. They were independent-minded communists, but they're not now going to be allowed to have any kind of independence, as far as I can see.
Alex, I'm hearing rumors from various sources that there's a colour revolution being planned for this region. Does this smack of that type of operation?
Yes, it does, Mike. I've covered a number of colour revolutions from close up. I'll just leave it at that because we don't want to get into anything secretive. But it's very much what you do. You spend 5 or 6 years, I say, if you're the globalist behind it all, stoking the tensions and also pulling the key players out to the West to educate them in the LSE or in New York. And then when you think that these players have come to the boil, then you start the protests, then you have the wave of arrests, and then you start manipulating the TV, because in most of these Eastern European countries, papers don't contribute to public opinion, and the internet doesn't, it's only TV. You start priming people to think that there must be change. And certainly, as far as the globalists are concerned, Serbia is unfinished business. It's not good enough for them that 6 of the 7 former Yugoslav republics are now creatures of the EU or satellites of it. It has to be all 7. The plan was always to get Serbia out because Serbia is a proud and independent country. As Norman Tebbit once said when he was still in the House of Commons, a brave Christian country that never did us any harm.
Alex, thank you for that. Well, of course, we and many people are always looking for who the hand is manipulating behind the scene to cause the breakdown, the violence, the colour revolution, the wars. And one of the books that we've mentioned quite a lot and I think has influenced quite a lot of people is the European Union Collective Enemy of Its Member States. This is the Christopher Story book, and I have to say it's the one that many years ago I was reading with a cup of tea, and I particularly paid attention to its mention of subversion. You've got some comments. I'll just put up a picture of the author, Christopher Story, real name Edward Hall. Unfortunately no longer with us, but I think this was him talking at a British Constitution Group event, Mike, of some years ago. So very pleased that man was able to speak to us. And of course his book has awakened many people. What's your thoughts on it, Alex?
Well, I'd say it's, as with the one I plugged last time I was on, which is much more from an overtly evangelical Christian perspective, the book called Truth as a Lonely Warrior. This is also one of those top-level books. If you're new to the conspiracy and hunting it out, then one of the best places you can start is Mr. Story. Again, a very educated man, and I think that the key about it is that he sees that the European Union is being manipulated by external players. It's not in the interests of any member state. That's why his subheading is Enemy of Its Member States. By the way, just search any internet search engine. If you type in European Union Collective PDF, then you'll find it quite easily mirrored on a number of sites. It's one of those books that you have to read in bits, but it is in logical order. And the point he's making is, yes, that the European Union is not even in Germany's interest as it is. It's being driven by something external. Now, with respect to such a great researcher as Mr. Story, I, as a much younger man who's been looking at this much less long, have to say that his shortcoming is this, that at the bottom of the page he says it's a Russian and German strategy and he calls it Lenin's World Revolution. Yes, but if you look at the Russians and Germans, neither of them has ever had any intent to dominate even Western Europe, let alone the English-speaking world, only to resist attempts by the English-speaking world to dominate them and to do them out of their own areas of influence. If you both parts of that subheading are, to my mind, incompletely informed. It's not a Russian and German plot. It's a plot by internationalist bankers, and no, I do not mean that as code for Jews. I mean internationalist bankers, including some Jews and others, from New York, to fund world revolution, and as he says in the second part of his subheading, to complete Lenin's world revolution. Well, Lenin didn't give a fig for Russia and said so in terms. It's not Lenin's world revolution. He was a paid puppet. It is a globalist world revolution. And if you can get past this Russian and German sinister plot stuff, which is a feature of the generation Mr. Story was in, then you will see that it's actually a plan from subversives within.
Alex, thank you very much for that. Mike, if you can just manage to pop the slide back on screen. I just wanted to bring this bit in because you've mentioned subversion now. This was the table somewhere near the front of the book, if I remember correctly. I read this and it instantly brought home to me military textbooks basically warning of the dangers of subversion. So what we had here was the plan to, first of all, demoralise the West, 20 to 30 years. Everything was going to be attacked: religion, education, media, culture, law and order, security, foreign affairs, family, population, labour relations. All of those were going to be infiltrated and disrupted. And I could say, you could go with a pen now and tick each one has been completed. And that was to lead into the really dangerous phase, the destabilization phase of 2 to 5 years, power struggle economy. And essentially it was saying that this was going to be the breakdown of society, where Big Brother, they use that terminology, Big Brother would appear from the wings. And that would lead into crisis, full-blown chaotic breakdown and violence on the streets. And after that, normalisation, which was the, in my early military days, that was the code for we've entered the new political frame. Alex, I'll just let you comment on that, and then I think perhaps Mark might like to come in, because of course we are talking much bigger interest than simply 2 nation states.
Yes, to wrap that up, George Orwell, who was a generation and a half before Story, didn't invent the term Big Brother. It was told to him, like so many of these sci-fi writers of the mid-century. He was actually clued up to what was going on. He was only one removed from the conspiracy. He had relatives and friends and colleagues who let him in on the fact that it was all being planned. And I would also say that they're always running behind schedule. This table, which is very 1980s language, the SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty and so on, is as it was planned in the time when the last KGB defectors came out to Britain and America in the 80s. They're always expecting, particularly the nervous Russian defectors who whistleblow, that the destabilization is just around the corner. And indeed it is, because the globalists have been beaten back for the last generation. Let's not lose heart and let's not forget that. They've always thought that next time, next crucial phase will be it. 1992 was mentioned, 2000, 2012, 2015, all years have come and gone without global governance and destabilization. So there is hope. And I'm very interested to hear what Mark says, particularly about the US origin of Lenin and world communism.
Mark, excuse me, Mark, we've got you on screen. Hopefully audio's still there.
That's a lot to address. Hope I'm coming through clearly. Yeah, George Orwell was kind of the Carroll Quigley of his time. Carroll Quigley, of course, was the Georgetown professor who was let in on the conspiracy and was a professor of one Bill Clinton, whose lovely wife Hillary is running for president right now. God save the United States. But yeah, Lenin through Trotsky, there's some U.S. origins to that. And that's a lot of history to cover in this format. But certainly, the Bilderberg Group had a lot with the planting the seeds of the EU tyranny. I don't know if Christopher Story would address that or not, where they converted the European movement or merged with the European movement and through Joseph Redinger to create Bilderberg and hold the first Bilderberg meeting with CIA funding and sort of overthrow the normal European nation-state order. But that's been sort of the push forward, of course, is to overthrow the autarkic self-sufficiency of nations, overthrow the nation state, overthrow the primacy of the organic family within the nation state, and go down the list, as you guys are talking about, to overthrow all these different facets of society. And there is a global government already operating in the financial sense, in my opinion. It's just that they're not all the way there with every single chess piece in their global chess game. The financial system is the foundation of it, and that's already a global system. But there is, as Alex said, and rightly so, there's been a lot of pushback, and it's been constantly delaying the full implementation of this all-encompassing tyranny. Try hard though they may, they haven't fully succeeded, and Alex is right, we can take heart in that.
Mark, thank you very much for that. It is quite extraordinary sometimes how our news programmes pan out, because we don't know exactly what our commentators will say on a particular subject. But you've given me a wonderful lead into this, which I'll do very quickly. Of course, we believe that Julia Middleton's efforts of the political charity Common Purpose came out of Common Cause, principally in the USA. And I'm going to thank our viewer for alerting us to the Common Cause Handbook. I'll take you through our very quick research on this, but it's absolutely fascinating. Here's the organisation, the Public Interest Research Centre. We're saying, who are these people and what is giving them the right to interfere with our lives? Well, they're working on all the big charities, so Oxfam, the World Wildlife Fund, which will make Mike Robinson very happy, Action for Children. And then in the background, we've got this, the Society for Participation, Engagement, Action and Knowledge Sharing. This is an independent organisation, just happens to have been working with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. There's your connection with the big bankers. And oh, look at the bottom, the European Commission. And what are they up to? Well, they want to change our values, and they say one of the most neglected factors in pushing for change is the set of values that motivate people. So they're going to get in amongst our values at every opportunity. And they go on to say that they are going to build a more sustainable, equitable and democratic world. And we need to be empowered and connected through a durable movement of citizens. So together we can create a more compassionate society and a better world. And they are going to do it operating totally outside any electoral system or control. And where's their funding coming from? The big banks. Here's some of their values. What is this document about? I will tell you in 2 seconds. But they're into every possible area that a society or community could be looking at. And here's the meat of it when people have asked, what is all this about? Where's it come from? So if we just blow some of it up, this is raw psychology. Schwartz, built on the research of social psychologist Milton Rockich, if I pronounce that correctly. And their model, so it's all theories, it's myth, it's mythology, but according to these people, these are the men who have designed the new world. We've got this one. It's based on the values component of the European Social Survey, the largest trans-European social survey with 30 countries, and it's part of the World Value Survey. So here we're now in the world globalist role. It's all real, but of course it's all theory, but they don't tell you that. And then somebody says, is it ethical? Look what they do, what the response is. No campaign, communication, policy or institution is ever value-free. Recognising this and the impact of values on behaviour, the question instead becomes, which values do we want to endorse? So these people twist the question, get rid of it, and then they pose the question that they want to respond to. And I'll lead it on through, and I'll come back to both of you for a quick reply. Where's it linked into? Well, the Common Cause Foundation, which is itself supported by the World Wildlife Fund, they came out with a report, Common Cause, the case for working with our cultural values, and the Common Cause Handbook was a simple offshoot of that. So big money in through the World Wildlife Fund. And these are the sort of people behind it. This is the author of the report, Tom Crompton. Who's he connected with? Well, this is an interesting man, Hayton Shah, and he is the chief executive of the Royal Statistical Society that's been meeting, amongst others, at Windsor Castle. I'll leave you to think who might have been present for that. But their vision is a world where data are at the heart of understanding and decision making. And we just rub it in a bit because this man's also been involved with Nesta. So here's Common Cause. Maybe this is a little bit of the hidden hand manipulating world politics that Christopher Story wasn't able to identify at the time he was doing his research. Alex, quick comment from you, if you would.
Yes, the funding there, Roundtree. Okay, these are non-taxable trusts that were set up in the United States in the 1950s and the equivalent in Britain. And we understand that these are just fronts for phenomenally rich people and banking families to achieve their ends. But in terms of the World Wildlife Fund and Oxfam, what motivates them to get crunching big data like this? What changes of behaviour are they interested in? Well, we know the World Wildlife Fund and its patrons, Prince Philip and his Dutch equivalent, who died a few years ago, the German Prince Bernhard, who was behind Bilderberg and all kinds of nasty stuff. What they're interested in is persuading people or forcing them to get off the land, to leave it to animals, because the World Wildlife Fund's vision of the world is one where there are fewer people and animals are left alone. And the Oxfam vision of the world, I'm not saying that there are not many good people there, but their angle here is clearly, obviously going to be, there are too many poor people making poor choices, as the Oxfam type would call it, the NGO type. And they need to be persuaded to what? Not to have children, to go and live somewhere else in a high rise in a city, perhaps, instead of in their native village. That's the angle I would see this from.
Okay, thank you for that. And Mark, hopefully you could hear Alex's comments.
Yes, I hope I'm coming through clearly. I concur. This is a front for the super rich primarily, although there are good, well-intended people in these organizations. I'll mention from what I've been doing, and I got an article coming up soon. Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's one of the common Bilderberg attendees, is going right along the same line. She's been speaking out lately, not talking about her Bilderberg pedigree, of course, they never do, but speaking along the same lines that Common Cause Foundation type organizations, think tanks, and NGOs can determine our future using this foundation money that comes from the super rich, make it look democratic, when in fact it's just another part of the globalist movement, only it's done through private channels and NGOs and think tanks. So Anne-Marie Slaughter of Bilderberg, a steady attendee there with that secretive group, she's really pushing this same envelope. I'm going to check and see if some of the same organizations show up.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that. Looking at the clock, it's time for us to end. So I'll also say goodbye, or thank you and goodbye to Alex as well. Thank you both very much for your reports and analysis. And we'll just leave our viewers and listeners with this one. This is from Leeds, where we're seeing more evidence that this quasi-political system going very strongly for our children and for youth. Here are the elections for members of Youth Parliament in Leeds. And this is drawing children into the political system. Principally, this is the EU and world government system. But what's the objective? Get these youngsters early, indoctrinate them, the future leaders, to rule over us. Well, there we are. Don't forget Ian Crane's court case tomorrow. So please attend if you can and give Ian support. How are we going to counter this encroaching dictatorship? Well, it's got to be for all people, all good people, to stick together, to support one another. And remember that polite, well-behaved, but still forceful response from the public is immensely powerful. And of course, it prevents the excuse for bringing in those draconian powers and the paramilitary police on the streets. That's it from us today. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Thank you for joining UK Column News. Bye-bye.